The sun on the desert planet burned like fire, and the sky above was empty without even a single cloud as the heat shimmered across the endless sand and sharp stones. The wind carried dust like knives, and silence ruled every inch of the land where nothing seemed to move or breathe, except for the slow crawl of time itself in this cruel place. A man named Mark drove his sand rover through the golden waves of dry land, his eyes hidden behind thick goggles and his mouth covered to keep out the sting of dust. He had been traveling alone for weeks, searching for minerals, but also perhaps for something else he himself didn't fully understand. The sandstorm hit. Without warning, it rose like a wall of smoke and fire, turning the world into a blur of rage and choking heat. Mark stopped his rover and activated the shields waiting inside as the wind roared and the metal shook around him. When the storm passed, he stepped outside to check the damage, and that was when he saw it. Something was lying in the sand not far from the ridge. At first he thought it was a mirage, but as he moved closer, he saw a shape curled into itself, skin cracked and pale lips dry and trembling. It was not human. Her features were soft, yet strange. Her skin had a faint shimmer, and her hair was white like moonlight. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow, and her limbs twisted as if she had fallen from great height or walked through pain for too long. Her body bore wounds old and new, and her clothes were torn and covered in dust as if she had been crawling for hours, if not days. Mark stood there frozen, unsure what to do. He had heard stories of aliens. Some were dangerous, some were wild, but this one was dying right in front of him. He could leave her and no one would know. He could drive away and say nothing, but something in him refused to move away. He saw her lips move slightly, her fingers twitch, her chest rise with struggle, and without thinking he bent down and gently turned her onto her back. She was burning with fever, her skin dry to the touch, and her voice was only a whisper that made no sense, but it reached into him like a plea for help. He lifted her into his arms carefully. She weighed almost nothing, and her head rested against his shoulder as he carried her to the rover. The heat was rising fast, and he knew she would not survive another hour outside. He laid her down in the back seat and gave her a little water, using a cloth to wet her lips. She tried to speak again, and this time he caught a word: danger, or maybe coming. It was hard to tell, but her eyes opened for a second and locked onto his as if trying to tell him something very important. Mark started the engine and drove fast, heading toward his shelter. Hidden behind the cliffs, a small base he had built years ago. It was not much, but it had supplies, clean water, and enough shade to keep her safe. He kept looking at her through the mirror. Her breathing was slow, and her skin had started to turn darker where the sun had burned her, but she was alive, and for now that was enough. Inside the shelter, he laid her on the cot and covered her with a blanket. The lights were dim and the air was cooler here. He brought water and cleaned her wounds slowly. Carefully, her skin healed faster than human skin, but the damage was deep, and she winced every time he touched her. Still, she didn't push him away. She just looked at him, eyes full of fear and something else, something he couldn't name yet. For hours he watched over her, checking her pulse, making sure she drank enough water and stayed still. She slept most of the time, but now and then she would open her eyes and try to speak. Her voice broken and slow, her language mixed with English and strange sounds, but Mark listened carefully, catching pieces of warning and names he didn't know by evening. She had gained a little strength enough to sit up with help. Her hands were thin and shaking, but her gaze was stronger than before. She pointed at the sky, and then at her chest, and then at Mark, and finally back at the door. It was clear she was afraid that someone or something was coming for her, and that if he helped her, he would also be in danger. Mark didn't care, not anymore. He had lived alone for too long, talked to no one, shared nothing, and now here was someone, a stranger from the stars maybe, but someone who needed help, and he had the chance to give it to her. He brought her food, but she shook her head. Instead, she asked for paper and drew symbols, circles, lines, shapes he didn't understand at first. But slowly a pattern appeared. It was a map, or maybe a signal path, something related to a ship or a tracking device. She pointed again at her chest, and he realized there Might be something inside her, something that was sending her location to whoever had left her here. Or whoever was still looking for her. He checked her back and near her spine. He felt a hard spot like metal just under the skin. He looked at her. And she nodded slowly, her face full of pain and fear. Night came and stars filled the sky above the desert, cold wind replacing the cruel heat. Mark stepped outside for a moment, breathing in the silence, but deep down he felt the change. The world had shifted around him. He was no longer just a man in a desert looking for minerals. Now he was part of something larger, something dangerous maybe, but also something real inside. The shelter the alien girl now rested peacefully, her chest rising and falling in rhythm with the quiet hum of machines. Mark sat beside her and stared at the door, knowing that whatever was coming would find them soon, and he would have to choose again, to run or to fight, but he had already made that choice when he lifted her from the sand and carried her through the storm. He didn't need to say it out loud. He would not leave her, not now, not ever. Morning arrived slowly over the desert as the cold of night gave way to the burning light once again, and the heat began to rise over the horizon like a living wave. The small shelter built between rocks remained quiet from the outside, but inside something had already started to change as the girl lying on the cot opened her eyes and looked around the room with slow, careful movements as if waking from a nightmare. Her breathing was steadier now, and her body, though still weak, had stopped trembling. Her gaze searched for the man who had saved her, and soon she saw him sitting in the corner, his head down, his arms folded across his chest, lost in sleep. Room was filled with silence, but it was no longer empty. It held a quiet connection between two beings from different worlds. The girl shifted slightly and winced from the pain in her back. Mark woke at once and moved to her side without a word. He brought water and helped her sit up. Her fingers still shook, but she managed to drink slowly. Her eyes met his, and for the first time she gave a small nod, not just of thanks, but of trust. He asked her name gently, not pushing too hard. And after a moment, she whispered it, Lyra. The sound was soft, almost like wind passing through leaves, and it hung in the air between them. Mark said his name too, and she repeated it slowly as if tasting the shape of it. Her voice cracked with each syllable, but it grew stronger each time she spoke. They could not understand each other fully, but the need to communicate forced them to try. She pointed at her arm, where faint scars showed strange markings, then pointed at the machine Mark used for scanning, and slowly they built a method of sharing pieces of truth. Mark connected the scanner to his system and tried to analyze the foreign material under her skin. It was not just a wound. Was a device, something alive and dangerous. It pulsed faintly and seemed to respond to heat or movement. Lyra drew on paper again, her hand shaky, but her symbols clearer. This time she sketched a rough image of a ship, then a group of figures, then a single line that led to the desert where she was found. Her fingers tapped the figure that was alone. Then her own chest. It became clear she had been sent here, abandoned by her own people, maybe even hunted. Mark frowned, trying to piece the meaning. Her eyes filled with sadness as she pointed again at the symbol of the group, and then crossed it out. She had been betrayed or left behind. Mark had no way of knowing why, but he could see the truth in her face and the pain that ran deeper than her wounds, and in the way she avoided mirrors or metal surfaces as if she could not bear to see herself. They spent the next day in silence, working side by side. Mark fixed the broken circuits in the shelter while Lyra rested and observed. She asked questions in broken English, and Mark answered using simple words she began to understand more quickly than he expected, sometimes even finishing his sentences with short replies. Her intelligence became clear, but it was her patience that surprised him most. She never rushed or demanded, only listened, watched, and learned. That night they shared a meal made from dry packs and filtered water. Nothing tasted good, but it was warm, and it gave them comfort. They sat near the edge of the open doorway, where the stars above sparkled like frozen fire, and the wind whispered across the rocks. Lyra looked up and for a long time said nothing. Then she spoke softly, telling him about her world, her people, her mission, though the words were broken, and Incomplete. Mark could feel the weight of what she said. They had gone too far, trusted the wrong leaders. And when she questioned them, she was cast out. He asked if she had family or friends, and she looked away. Her silence said enough. Mark wanted to say something, but the words felt useless in the face of such loss. So he simply placed a blanket over her shoulders and nodded, as if to say she was no longer alone. She looked at him with tired eyes, and for a moment her face softened, not in fear or pain, but something gentler, something that had not lived in her heart for a long time, just as they began to believe they might have more time. A sound broke the peace, a low hum from the distance, not like wind, not like thunder. It was steady, mechanical, cold. Mark stood at once and stepped outside, scanning the sky with sharp eyes. Lyra followed, and when she saw the faint light in the sky, her face turned pale. A ship was coming. It moved like a predator, silent and fast, sweeping across the clouds with purpose. Lyra gripped Mark's arm and pointed to her chest again, then to the sky, then to the device he had scanned earlier. Mark understood. They had found her, and they were coming fast back inside. They moved quickly, gathering supplies, turning off power systems to avoid detection, and sealing the metal walls with sand to reduce heat signature. Lyra helped, even though her body was weak. Her movements precise and fast, her survival instincts sharp. Mark admired her strength and her silence. She did not cry or panic, only prepared. They knew the ship might land or pass over or send drones to search. Mark armed his old rifle and checked the perimeter, while Lyra used a small tool hidden in her boot to disable part of the device in her back. It sparked and smoked, and she nearly collapsed, but she gave a thumbs up and whispered, "Done." The hum grew louder now, and the ground began to shake slightly, dust falling from the ceiling as Mark stood ready, rifle in hand, and Lyra behind him, her eyes locked on the doorway. They were not sure what would happen next, but one thing was clear. They would face it together, not as enemies, not as strangers, but as survivors holding onto a fragile bond, stronger than fear. Sky no longer felt like sky. It had become a threat, a watcher, a warning. Mark stood outside the shelter, his hands gripping the old rifle, as the distant hum grew louder, spreading across the desert like a wave of pressure. The sound came from above, but also from within, as if the very air had changed its nature. Lyra stayed inside, crouched near the edge of the doorway, her breath slow and steady, but her eyes wide with tension, her body ready to move at any moment. They did not speak, they did not need to. Ship appeared like a ghost through the haze, black and silver, with sharp angles and long shadows. Its movements were smooth and cold, not like human ships that shook or rumbled. This one glided like it belonged to the wind itself. It did not land near them, but hovered above a ridge some distance away. Then light scanned the ground, a blue glow, sweeping the sand in long patterns, searching not just for shape, but for life. Mark stepped back into the shelter, closed the door, and looked at Lyra. She pointed to the far wall where he kept old maps and a signal scanner. The screen blinked once, twice, then showed a red pulse. They were being scanned and possibly tracked. She touched her back where the device had once pulsed, and gave him a quick nod, her face pale but calm. She had managed to block it partly, but the trace still lingered like a shadow. They had little time. The ship might send scouts or drones, or worse. Mark opened a locked crate, pulled out an emergency pack, and motioned for Lyra to follow. They would not wait to be found. They would move and try to reach the communication tower miles away, hidden in the canyon beyond the dead cliffs. If they could reach it, they might send a signal to the human outpost before the enemy closed in. The journey was not easy. The sand was deep and soft in some places and hard like stone in others. The heat returned with full strength, burning through the air and filling their lungs with fire. Mark guided the way, watching for shadows or changes in the wind that might mean movement above. Lyra followed closer, steps light and sure. Despite her wounds, she never complained, never asked to stop, but Mark could see the pain in the way she held her side. Her skin shimmered in the sunlight, and sweat clung to her face like glass. They reached a narrow pass between two hills where dry trees stood like broken bones. Mark paused and scanned The sky again, nothing but silence. Then a sharp sound pierced the air, a thin whine followed by a flash of metal slicing through the air. A drone appeared from behind a ridge, fast and quiet, shaped like a winged needle with no face and no mercy. It dived toward them, weapons ready to fire. Mark pushed Lyra down and rolled behind a rock. The drone fired a burst that hit the ground and sent sand flying into the air. Mark fired back, but his rifle was too old and slow. The drone curved around for another attack, this time aiming directly for Lyra. She tried to run but stumbled as her leg gave out. Mark shouted and ran toward her, his arms grabbing her just in time as the drone fired again. The blast missed them, but the heat singed the edge of her cloak. Lyra reached into her belt and pulled a small object, a sharp metallic shard that pulsed with light. She threw it toward the drone, and as it struck the machine, a surge of static erupted, blinding light filling the sky. For a moment, the drone jerked, then spun out of control, crashing into the ground with a loud crunch. Silence returned, broken only by their heavy breathing. Mark looked at her, amazed. She had just saved them both with a single move. Lyra smiled weakly, then collapsed, her energy drained and her body trembling. Mark lifted her again, holding her tightly, and continued walking toward the canyon. The sun was falling, now the light turning red and the shadows growing longer. Each step felt heavier, each breath more shallow. But he kept going, never letting her go. They reached the edge of the canyon as night began to fall below them. The rocky walls opened like a wound in the earth, and deep inside stood the old tower once used for mining, now half buried in dust but still tall enough to reach the signals in orbit. Mark climbed carefully, Lyra leaning against his back, too weak to speak or move, her heartbeat soft against his shoulder. Inside the tower he found the console still active, the solar backup just enough to power the main system. He typed the code and activated the signal boost, then opened the channel to the nearest outpost, repeating the message again and again until the light blinked green. The signal had been sent. Help might come if they were lucky, and if time allowed. Lyra lay on the floor, her eyes closed, her body still, her skin cold. Mark knelt beside her and held her hand, waiting, watching, hoping. The night outside grew colder, the stars above sharp and cruel, like the eyes of silent gods. But within the tower there was still warmth, not from the machines but from the bond between two souls who had faced death together and still chosen to fight. Mark checked his rifle again, knowing the ship might follow the drone's signal or find them by the trace left behind. He prepared traps using broken wires and pieces of metal, anything to slow down whatever came. Next, Lyra stirred once, her voice barely a whisper, as she looked at him, her fingers brushing his sleeve, not with fear but with trust. They had no promises, no future, no plan beyond survival, but in that moment, they understood one thing clearly: whatever came, they would not face it alone. Night wrapped itself around the canyon like a thick curtain, hiding dangers. In its folds, the stars above watched with silent eyes, and the wind whispered through broken metal and dry stone. Mark stayed near the entrance of the tower, his rifle in his hands, his back against the wall, his eyes moving through the shadows while the echo of distant engines still rang in his ears. Lyra rested behind him inside the tower, where the machines hummed softly, keeping the signal alive, and the faint light glowing across her pale face. Mark had seen many things in the desert: storms that tore down mountains, fires that rose from broken machines, ruins filled with silence, and stories lost forever. But never had he seen something like this: an alien once left for dead, now resting under his care while enemies circled above in machines that hunted like wolves. He checked the traps again. Thin wires stretched across the narrow path leading to the tower, old canisters filled with pressurized air hidden under stones. Sharp metal pieces placed where feet might step in haste. Lyra opened her eyes slowly, her body still weak but her spirit strong. She tried to rise, and Mark helped her up gently. She pointed at the sky, then at her wrist where the scars from the implant still glowed faintly. She spoke softly, telling him that the enemy would not stop until they had what they came for. They believed she still carried information or technology, or maybe they just wanted her silence. Mark nodded, not needing to ask more. He understood now that this was not only about survival, but about standing for something more. The sound returned just before dawn, a deep rumble from above shaking dust from the stone walls. Mark looked up and saw the ship again, larger now, lower, its surface gleaming under the fading stars. It hovered for a moment, then released 3 dark figures that dropped like knives toward the canyon floor. They moved with precision, wearing armor that reflected no light, their weapons drawn, their eyes hidden behind black masks. They were not here to talk, they had come to end what had been started. Mark took his position near the outer edge, waiting, breath held, heart steady, his finger near the trigger. As the first enemy stepped into the trap, the wire snapped and the canister exploded with a loud hiss, throwing dust and rock into the air. Mark fired once, then again. The shot struck the armor, but only slowed the figure who pushed forward through the smoke. Lyra appeared beside him, holding a tool in her hand, not a weapon, but something that pulsed with blue light. She raised it and pointed it at the figure. The pulse struck the armor and made it hum with static, forcing the figure to stumble and fall. Mark moved in and used the rifle to finish what the pulse had started. The second figure leapt from the rocks above, trying to flank them, but Lyra was faster. She threw a small disc that clung to the enemy's leg and released a burst of light that sent the figure crashing into the wall. The third enemy was the strongest, moving with speed and force, breaking through the rocks like a wild animal. Mark fought him hand to hand as his rifle was now empty. The clash echoed through the canyon, fists and blade sparks flying from each strike. Lyra tried to help, but her strength failed and she collapsed. Mark saw her fall, and his anger rose like fire. He grabbed a broken piece of metal and drove it into the weak point of the enemy's armor. The figure fell with a heavy thud, and the canyon became quiet once more, breathing hard and covered in dust. Mark ran to Lyra, lifting her in his arms. Her pulse was slow but steady. She opened her eyes and tried to speak, but he placed a finger on her lips and told her to rest for now. She had done enough. The sky above began to change as the sun returned, painting the walls in gold and fire. The ship above moved slowly, now uncertain, perhaps confused by the silence below. Then the signal light blinked green again, and a voice crackled through the tower system, a human voice from the outpost, asking for location and status. Mark answered quickly, giving coordinates and requesting immediate assistance. He told them he had wounded and a possible enemy ship still nearby. Within minutes, the response came back. A patrol had been dispatched and would arrive within the hour. Mark sat beside Lyra, holding her hand as the morning wind swept through the canyon, cooling their skin and washing away the dust of battle. Time passed slowly. The sound of engines finally reached them, not from above, but from the desert beyond. 4 human vehicles arrived, filled with soldiers, who quickly secured the area and examined the bodies of the attackers. Their faces showed surprise and confusion at what they found. One of them asked Mark what had happened, and he explained simply they had come to kill her, and I did not let them. The commander looked at Lyra, then back at Mark, and nodded without asking more. They took Lyra into the medical vehicle and began treating her wounds. The human doctor said she would survive, though her body needed time and care. Mark stood nearby, silent as the machines worked. He felt the weight of everything now lifting from his shoulders, not gone but shared, and that made all the difference. The enemy ship had vanished by the time the sun reached its highest point, perhaps retreating or perhaps waiting for another time. Mark returned to the tower once more, gathering what he could, repairing what was broken, and marking the ground where the fight had ended, not as a grave, but as a memory of a choice made in the heat of fear and fire, a choice to protect a life, not his own, a choice to stand, not run. By the time he returned to the outpost, Lyra was resting in a clean bed, surrounded by machines that beeped softly. Her skin looked better, her breathing smooth, and her eyes opened. As he entered, she gave a small smile and reached for his hand. No words were needed. They had already said everything without speaking. The sun hung high above the outpost, as if watching the world move slowly under its gaze. Its heat pressed down, but no one complained, for the air now felt different, as if something heavy had been lifted. The walls of the human settlement were tall, made of metal, and old rock, but inside there was movement and life. Soldiers walked with purpose, workers repaired broken parts, and medics moved from room to room checking supplies and healing wounds. But in the center of the outpost, behind thick glass in a quiet medical room, a moment of peace had taken root. Lyra lay on the bed, her body wrapped in clean fabric wires, connected to machines that hummed softly. Her breathing was smooth, her skin no longer burned, her eyes no longer filled with fear. She looked around the room, at the soft lights, the smooth walls, the humans who passed by outside without pointing weapons or shouting orders. It was strange to her, this calm, this care, not something she had known before. Mark sat beside her, his arms resting on the chair, his eyes tired but alert. He had not left her side since the tower, since the fight, since the day they stood together in that burning canyon. He had chosen to stay near her, not because anyone told him to, not because of duty, but because something inside him had changed. Something that had long been still had begun to move again. Doctors told him she would recover, that her body was strong, that whatever her species was made of, it knew how to fight back. They also said she might need help adjusting if she stayed here, if she lived among humans. And Mark had nodded, not saying much, but knowing deep down that he would be the one to help her, even if no one else understood. Days passed slowly, but with progress. Lyra walked again, first with help, then on her own, her steps unsure but steady. Her voice grew clearer, English stronger. She began to ask questions about the outpost, about the world beyond the desert, about the humans who now looked at her, not with fear but with curiosity. Some still avoided her, some whispered behind her back, but most had heard what she and Mark had done. They had seen the reports. They knew that she had saved a human and fought her own kind. The commander of the outpost, a tall man with a deep voice, called Mark and Lyra to his office. He offered Lyra a choice. She could return to space if she found a ship willing to carry her, or she could stay here and live under human protection, not as a prisoner, but as a guest. Lyra had listened quietly, then turned to Mark, her eyes asking the question she could not speak, and his answer was simple: stay. So she stayed. Mark helped her find a place in the outpost near the outer walls, where she could see the sky each morning and the stars each night. She began to help the engineers learn their systems, help the guards understand how her people thought, how their machines worked, what weaknesses they had, and where dangers might rise again. The humans began to trust her slowly, not all at once, but like drops of water filling a jar, one moment at a time. Together, she and Mark started patrolling the edge of the desert, riding the same rover that once carried her from death. They searched for signals, rescued lost drones, marked old crash sites, and sometimes just drove in silence, letting the wind remind them of where they had come from and how far they had walked since then. Lyra asked one day why he had saved her, and Mark had looked at the sky before answering, because I saw someone trying to survive and I had the power to help her, and because no one should die alone in the sand, and because maybe I needed saving too. They sat for a while, not speaking, and the silence between them felt warm, not empty, not broken, just full of something quiet and real. Lyra told him more about her past in slow, careful words. She had been a scout, not a soldier sent to explore, but when she refused to follow certain orders, when she questioned her leaders' plans, they had marked her as a threat, left her on the desert planet as punishment. She had not expected anyone to find her, and she never imagined that a human would be the one to offer his hand. Mark listened without judgment, without pity, just with presence, and she knew then that this place, this strange, hard world, had given her something she had never found in all her travels, a reason to stay. Time passed, the scars on her body faded, but the ones in her memory remained, though they no longer ruled her. Now she walked through the outpost without fear. She worked with others, spoke with them, taught and learned and laughed, though it was still rare and quiet. And when she smiled, the humans around her smiled too, not because of her face or her strange eyes, but because they saw someone who had chosen to be one of them, someone who had crossed a bridge that most never even dared to build. Mark and Lyra became known across the desert as the ones who stood together, as the pair who fought back, as the story that spread From one station to another across radios and screens told in pieces passed along by traders and soldiers and workers, who needed to believe that something good could still grow from the dust, and though neither of them sought fame or thanks there, names began to carry meaning, not because of power but because of choice, because they had faced the edge and stepped forward together. On one quiet night as stars filled the sky and the wind moved gently through the rocks, Mark and Lyra stood outside the outpost looking at the desert, not with fear but with memory. The land that once tried to kill them now stood silent and calm under the moon. Lyra turned to him and spoke without hesitation. "You changed my path." Mark looked at her and replied, "Maybe. You changed mine first." They stood there, not as human and alien, not as savior and saved, but as two beings who had learned that the line between survival and surrender, between fear and courage, between silence and understanding was not written in stars or skin or language. It was written in choice, and they had chosen each other. The end.